Picture a summer evening in the year 1150, somewhere in the wide green Bottomlands, east of what will one day be called St. Louis. A quick word before we go deeper. These stories don't end. There's a new unsolved one waiting here every night. If that's the kind of thing you'd leave on in the dark, subscribe and I'll keep them coming. Now, back to that summer evening. The sun is dropping low over the Mississippi River, and the sky burns the color of hammered copper. Smoke rises from 1,000 thatched roofs. Children run barefoot down packed earth streets. Somewhere in the distance, a wooden drum beats slow and steady, keeping time with the falling light. And rising above it all, higher than anything a person in this part of the world has ever seen, stands a mountain made by human hands. It is wider than 30 football fields at its base. It climbs in flat green terraces toward a sky the color of a bruise. On the very top sits a great wooden building, its walls painted in red and white, its roof crowned with carved posts that catch the last of the sun. This is Cahokia, and in this moment it is bigger than London. It is bigger than Paris. It is the largest city north of Mexico, and it will remain the largest city on this continent for another 600 years. Tens of thousands of people live here. Some scholars say 15,000. Others push the number to 40,000, maybe more. The disagreement itself tells you something about how strange this place is. We cannot even count its people with confidence, and yet we know they were here, because they left behind the earth they moved with baskets on their backs. They built more than 100 mounds. They laid out plazas the size of small towns. They raised a wooden wall 2 miles long around the sacred heart of the city. And then, for reasons no one can explain, they raised it again and again and again, and then, sometime in the next 200 years, they left. Not a war, not a conquest we can point to, not a volcano or an earthquake or any single disaster written into the soil. The city simply began to hollow out. The great houses stood empty. The plazas grew quiet. The fires on top of Monk's Mound burned lower each season until one night no one lit them at all. By the time the first French explorers paddled down the Mississippi in the late 1600s, Cahokia was a field of grassy hills. The people who lived nearby did not claim it. They did not seem to know who had built it. The mounds sat there, like the bones of some enormous sleeping animal, half swallowed by prairie grass and cottonwood roots. Tens of thousands of people, gone, and nobody in all the centuries since has been able to say with certainty where they went. That is the mystery we are going to sit with tonight. Not just the how of it, and not just the why, but the where. Where did all those farmers, potters, priests, traders, ball players, and children go when they picked up their bundles and walked away from the greatest city their world had ever known? Some archaeologists believe their descendants are the Osage, the Ponca, the Omaha, the Quapaw, the Kansa, the Siouan-speaking peoples who spread across the plains and river valleys in the centuries that followed. Others point to the Winota tradition, a culture that spread north into what is now Iowa and Wisconsin around the same time Cahokia was fading. Still others say the truth is messier than that Cahokia did not empty into one place, that its people scattered like seeds in a hard wind, and their descendants may live today in a dozen nations across half a continent. And a few, sitting quietly with the evidence, will tell you we may never know. Not really. Not the way we want to know. That is where our story begins. In a city that should not have existed, on a river that carries its silence downstream, under a sky that once glowed with the light of 10,000 hearths. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk its streets while they are still full. We are going to climb its mound while the drums still beat, and we are going to follow as best we can, the long, quiet path of a people who slipped out of history without leaving us a forwarding address. So settle in. The river is running low tonight, and Cahokia is waiting to be remembered. Picture the middle of the continent about 1,000 years ago. The year is close to 1050 by our modern calendar, though the people living here kept time by the sun and the moon and the slow turning of the stars. You are standing on a wide floodplain where the Missouri, the Illinois, and the Mississippi rivers all meet. The locals call this stretch the American Bottom, and it is one of the richest patches of soil in all of North America. Black earth, deep as a man is tall, soft as cake under bare feet. The land here is flat as a tabletop, stretching for miles in every direction. To the east, low bluffs rise like the shoulders of a sleeping animal, covered in oak and hickory and stands of tall grass. To the west, the great brown river curls through the valley, changing its shape from year to year, leaving crescent lakes and cut-off channels shining behind it like broken pieces of mirror. In the wet season, mist hangs over these waters at dawn. In the dry months, the air smells of warm mud and pollen and wood smoke. The trees here are older than any building in Europe at this time. Great sycamores with pale bark that peels off in sheets. Cottonwood so wide 3 grown men cannot circle one with their arms. Cypress in the swampy places, their knees poking up out of the black water. Bald eagles nest in the tops. White-tailed deer step down to the river at dusk, moving through the reeds like ghosts in brown coats. Now, across this flat, green world, imagine a skyline, not of stone, not of timber, but of earth. Great flat-topped pyramids of packed dirt, rising out of the plain in shapes that do not belong to nature. Some are small, only the height of a man. Some are the size of a country church, and one, in the center of it all, is a giant. It climbs 100 feet into the air in 4 broad terraces, wider at the base than the biggest pyramid at Giza. Grass covers its sides, wooden buildings crown its summit, smoke curls from the roof holes and drifts across the sky. There are more than 100 of these earthen mountains scattered across 6 square miles. Some are round, some are square, some are shaped like ridges, long and low, holding the bones of important dead. In the low light of morning, they cast blue shadows across the fields. In the red light of evening, they seem to glow from within, like loaves of bread pulled fresh from the ashes. Between the mounds sits a city. Thatch-roofed houses stand in neat rows, walls made of woven cane plastered with river clay. Doorways face the sunrise. Cook fires burn in front of each home, and the smell of roasted corn and simmering beans and river fish drifts on the breeze. Children run between the buildings, with dogs at their heels. Old women sit in the shade, weaving mats from bulrush. Men repair wooden hoes and stone axes and long river cane arrows. You can hear the city before you can see it all, the steady thump of wooden pestles pounding corn into meal, the chatter of trade in a dozen languages. Drums somewhere, always somewhere, keeping a slow, patient rhythm, a whistle carved from the wing bone of a swan, the bark of dogs, the cry of babies, the laughter of gamblers at the edge of the great plaza. Clothing here is soft leather and woven plant fiber, dyed in warm earthy colors, deep reds from bloodroot, yellows from goldenrod, browns from walnut hulls. The people wear their hair long, often bound up with cords of leather and decorated with copper beads or river pearls or shells traded from faraway coasts. Nobles wear cloaks of feathers, thousands of them, sewn one by one into patterns that ripple like water when they walk. At night, the city glows, cook fires by the thousand, torches on the Mound stairs, and above them all, on the summit of the greatest mound, a single tall building where a fire is kept burning every hour of every day and every night of every year. Sailors coming up the Mississippi in their long dugout canoes could see that fire from miles away, a lonely orange star floating above the black shape of the pyramid. This is Cahokia, at the height of its glory, a city of earth and grass and smoke and river light, and it is here, in this world of soft mud and endless sky, that our mystery takes root. Long before the great mounds rose against the sky, other people walked these bottomlands. They were farmers, hunters, and gatherers, and they knew this stretch of river better than anyone alive. Picture them now, in the soft light of a summer morning, moving through fields still wet with dew. Their feet leave prints in the black mud, their hands carry baskets woven from river cane. These early families lived in small villages tucked between the creeks. Their homes were low and round, built from bent saplings and mud packed against woven walls. Smoke curled from the roofs at dawn as women stirred pots of hominy and beans. Children chased frogs along the shallow ponds. Old men sat in the doorways and mended nets with fingers gnarled as roots. Their world was green and generous. The floodplains stretched flat for miles, so rich with silt that a walking stick could bloom if you left it long enough. Every spring, the rivers rose and spread a fresh coat of black soil across the fields. Every fall, the same fields gave back corn taller than a man, squash the size of a baby's head, and sunflowers heavy with oil-rich seeds. They called the corn their sister. That was the old way of speaking about things that fed you. Corn was a sister. The river was a grandfather. The moon was a grandmother who watched over women in childbirth. Everything had a name and a place in the family of the living world. Nothing they touched was empty of spirit. Their days moved with the sun. Men rose early and slipped into the marshes with bows of hickory and arrows tipped with chipped chert. They hunted deer along the timber edges, and geese where the sloughs opened wide. When they returned, they carried the animals across their shoulders, blood dark on their leggings, faces streaked with sweat and pride. The women met them at the fires and set to butchering with sharp flakes of stone. You could tell a woman's family by the pattern on her skirt. You could tell a man's clan by the tattoos across his chest, curling around the collarbone like vines. Some wore shells strung on sinew. Some wore feathers braided into their long dark hair. They painted their faces with red ochre for feasts and with white clay for mourning. They were not a poor people. They were not a simple people. They were farmers who had learned, over hundreds of quiet years, exactly what the land would give and exactly what it would take. They stored corn in deep pits lined with grass. They dried fish on wooden racks over slow fires. They knew which mushrooms grew after the spring rains and which berries came ripe when the whippoorwills started calling. Their pottery told stories the words have forgotten. Bowls the color of river clay, marked with the pressed rims of woven cord. Jars decorated with the shapes of frogs and birds and coiled snakes. Each piece was fired in a shallow pit, then polished with a smooth stone until it shone like wet leather. When a jar cracked, it was buried gently, the way you might bury a friend. Names have not survived from those years. The people who lived here left no writing, and the tongues they spoke are only guessed at now. But you can imagine them anyway. A young mother named for the morning star, a grandfather whose voice cracked like winter ice, a boy with a foxtail tied to his belt, running along the ridge with a wooden spear. They traveled by canoe when they could. The rivers were their roads, silver ribbons that carried them east and west, north and south. They traded with cousins downriver for copper the color of sunset. They traded with cousins upriver for chunks of galena that shimmered like little pieces of the moon. Word came in with every canoe, news of a hunt gone bad, a child born, a village that had moved. They danced when the corn came in. Around wide fires, they moved in slow circles, drums beating the sound of the earth's heart. Old women sang in high, clear voices about the time before, when the sky was still soft. Young couples slipped away into the tall grass. The stars turned above them, patient and bright as spilled milk. These were the people the Bottomlands knew. These were the people who saw the first stakes driven, the first mounds shaped by hand, the first plaza cleared of trees. They were the great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers of a city that had not yet dreamed itself into being, and on some warm evening in the year we now call 900, one of them looked up at the eastern ridge and felt something changing in the wind. Before the great mounds rose, before the plazas were flat and smooth as riverstone, the people of the Bottomlands lived quiet lives, small lives, ordinary lives, and those ordinary days stretched out for generations like a long, slow river, moving without hurry towards something none of them could see. Picture a scatter of small villages laid out along the creeks, round houses with walls of woven cane, sealed tight with clay and grass, roofs of thatch that sloped down low, catching the smoke of morning fires. Each house sat close to the next, forming little clusters of 10 or 20 homes. Between them ran narrow paths, worn smooth by bare feet. Dogs slept in the shade. Children chased each other around the storage pits. The land itself did most of the work. The Mississippi floodplain was rich as fresh bread. Black soil layered deep from 1,000 years of spring floods. A woman could push a wooden digging stick into that earth and feel it give way like soft dough. Corn grew tall here. Beans climbed the corn stalks. Squash spread its wide leaves along the ground and cooled the roots. The three sisters, the old people called them, though nobody who first spoke that name is left to say it out loud. Morning came slow in the Bottomlands. Mist rose off the sloughs in white curls. The sun cut through the cottonwoods in long yellow beams. Women stepped out to grind corn on flat stones, and the sound of that grinding, a soft, steady rasp, carried from house to house like a heartbeat. Men checked the fish traps set in the shallow backwaters. Boys ran errands with clay pots balanced on their heads. Girls learned to weave river cane into baskets tight enough to hold water. The gardens sat just beyond the houses, small plots, family plots, tended by hand. No fields stretched for miles yet. Nobody needed that much food. A family grew what a family could eat, with a little left over to trade or to store in the pits beneath their floors. Those storage pits, dug deep and lined with grass, kept dried corn sweet through the long, wet winters. When the snows came, a household could reach down through the packed earth and pull up summer. Trade moved slow but steady. A man from downriver might arrive in a dugout canoe with knots of freshwater pearls or slabs of chert for making blades. He would sit by the fire, eat what was offered, share news from villages 2 days away. In exchange, he took bundles of dried squash, or a pipe carved from soft red stone, or a length of woven cord dyed with walnut hulls. Nothing hurried, nothing pressed, just the quiet business of neighbors who knew each other's names. The first small mounds began to appear in those years. though nobody thought of them as the start of anything grand. They were low humps of earth, gentle rises where the dead were laid to rest. A grandmother went into the mound, and later a grandfather, and later a child taken by fever. The family piled fresh soil over them, basket by basket, and the mound grew a little each generation. It was a slow kind of monument, a quiet kind of remembering. Evening in the villages had its own rhythm. The cook fires burned low. Old men sat on woven mats and told stories that everyone had heard 100 times. The good stories, the ones that never lost their taste. Stories about the water panther who lived beneath the deep pools. Stories about the thunderbirds who nested in the far western hills. Stories about the first people who climbed up out of the earth and looked around and saw that the world was good. The stars came out thick and close over the bottomlands. Fireflies rose from the tall grass in slow yellow drifts. Frogs sang in the sloughs, thousands of them, a wet chorus that filled the dark from horizon to horizon. Somewhere a screech owl called, somewhere a baby cried, then hushed against a mother's shoulder. The night smelled of wood smoke and damp corn silk, and the mineral breath of the river. They did not know that anything was coming. They planted their gardens. They buried their dead in the small round mounds. They traded and ate and slept and woke and did it all again. Season after season, generation after generation, the bottomlands held them the way a bowl holds still water. Calm, steady, complete. Somewhere in those quiet years, a change began to stir, a gathering, a pulling together. Small villages started drifting closer. Certain families began to hold more sway, and the mounds, once so modest, started reaching for the sky. Something shifted in the bottomlands around the year 1050. Not slowly, not the way villages usually grew back then, with a lodge added here, a storage pit dug there, another baby born under another thatched roof. Something faster than that, something stranger. You can picture it if you close your eyes. A woman steps out of her small round house at dawn. The mist hangs low over the corn plots, thick as goose down. She hears the river breathing somewhere beyond the willows. She turns to grind meal at her grinding stone, as her mother did, as her grandmother did, and then she stops. She lifts her head, she listens, because there is a sound in the distance she has never heard before. It is the sound of many people, not a handful, not two families visiting from the next bend of the creek, Annie. The low murmur of voices rolling in from the south, like weather, drum beats under it, soft and steady, keeping time with something she cannot see. A song rising in a language that is almost hers, but not quite. The syllables land in the wrong places. The pitch bends where it should stay flat. She sets down her stone. She walks to the edge of her village. Other women are already standing there. Old men lean on their sticks and squint into the fog. Children cling to knees and stare. Nobody speaks. They all just watch the road, and down the road, out of the pale mist, the strangers come. They come in a line that has no end. Families with bundles on their backs, men carrying long poles wrapped in deer skin, women balancing pots on their hips, grandmothers walking slow and careful with grandchildren gripping their hands, dogs weaving between ankles. Some of the newcomers wear their hair in ways the local people have never seen. Some carry pipes carved from stones that shine like river ice. Some have faces painted in patterns that mean something the villagers cannot read. The line moves past the village and does not stop. It keeps flowing north, toward the great flat plain where the ground rises just a little above the floodline, toward the place where a few small mounds already stand like sleeping animals in the grass. That is where the newcomers set down their bundles. By afternoon, the smoke of 100 new fires rises into the sky. By evening, the sound of axes rings out across the bottomland, a dry, clean chock, chock, chock as trees come down. By the next dawn, the shape of new houses is already sketched in the mud, dark rectangles of post holes, waiting for walls. The old woman with the grinding stone walks out to see it. She stands at the edge of what will one day be a plaza wide enough to swallow 40 football fields. Right now, it is just trampled grass and busy hands. A stranger looks up from his work and smiles at her. He speaks, and she understands maybe half his words. He tells her a name. He tells her something is coming. Something is being built here. He gestures at the flat ground, and then at the sky, as if the two are about to meet. She goes home and does not sleep well that night. By the next moon, more come. By the next season, more still. They come from the river north, from the river south, from the prairies west, and from the woodlands east. Each group brings its own pots, its own songs, its own way of tying a knot or shaping a bowl. Their potsherds will confuse archaeologists 1,000 years later. Some clays will match soils from hundreds of miles away. Some tempering methods will point to villages nobody has yet found. It is as if a whole continent tilted and its people slid toward this one spot in the Bottomlands. Nobody today can say exactly why. There are guesses. A charismatic leader, a powerful vision, a new religion that promised something worth walking 1,000 miles to reach. A comet in the sky in 1054 that lit up the night for weeks and may have felt like a sign. Any of these could be true. All of them could be true. None of them can be proved. What can be proved is the ground itself, the post holes, the house floors, the sudden jump from a modest farming town to something that had never existed on this continent before. In a single lifetime, maybe two, a scatter of villages became a capital. The mist that had hung over the Bottomlands for centuries lifted, and where it lifted, a city stood. And the old woman at the edge of the plaza never quite understood what she had seen. Step into the heart of the city and stand where the crowds once stood. The great plaza stretches out before you, flat as a still pond, wide as 40 football fields laid side by side. The ground here is not natural. The people leveled it by hand, hauling away hills and filling low spots basket by basket. They wanted a floor for the whole world to gather on, and they made one. The plaza sits in the shadow of Monk's Mound. Grass grows soft and green across it in the warm months, cropped short by the feet of thousands. Smaller mounds ring the edges like watchful elders. Wooden posts rise here and there, painted red and black, tall as 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. Smoke from cook fires drifts across the open space, mixing with the smell of river mud and roasting corn. This is where the people talk. This is where the whole city trades news like coins. An old woman with silver braids sits on a woven mat near the western edge. She remembers when the plaza was smaller. Her grandmother told her stories of a time before the mounds grew so tall, when this land was just farms and scattered houses. Now she watches children run past with sticks in their hands, and she shakes her head at how quickly the world changes. Traders from the south stop to ask her the way to the copper workshops, and she points with a knotted finger. Nearby, 2 young men lean on their spears and argue about the game. Their voices carry across the flat ground, like birds calling over water. They are talking about Chunky, and everyone in Cahokia has an opinion about Chunky. The game is simple to watch and hard to play. One man rolls a smooth stone disc across the packed earth. The disc spins on its edge, humming as it goes. Then 2 players sprint after it, spears raised, and hurl their weapons at the spot where they think the stone will stop. The closest throw wins. The crowds bet on every roll: furs, shell beads, arrowheads, whole baskets of dried corn. The stones themselves are treasures. Some are polished for 100 years, passed from father to son, worn smooth as river glass. A good chunky stone has a name. A great one has a story. The old woman on the mat once saw a stone called Turtle's Back win a match that lasted 3 days. Around the players, the talk moves like wind through tall grass. A farmer from the North Bottoms says the corn came in thin this season. His neighbor says the same. A trader just back from the Ohio country claims he saw strange lights over the river 3 nights running. A priest, or someone dressed like one, says the sun is walking a shorter path this year, and that means the ceremonies must be done just right. There are always stories at the Plaza. Some are old. The old-timers remember a great flood in their grandparents' time. The river rose up and swallowed whole villages. Some say the mounds were built taller after that, so the people would always have high ground. Others whisper about a sickness that passed through long ago, taking children in their sleep. Nobody living saw it, but everyone knows the song their great-grandmothers sang to keep it away. There are newer worries too. Not everyone speaks them out loud. A woman selling clay pots murmurs that her cousin's family packed up and moved south last spring, just left. No goodbye feast, no ceremony. Their house stood empty for a month before someone else took it over. She says it happens more often now than it used to. Her friend nods and says nothing. A group of children chases a dog between the merchant blankets. Their laughter bounces off the sides of the small mounds. For them, the Plaza is the whole world, and the whole world is safe. A hunter home from the west tells anyone who will listen that the deer are moving different this year. They are going farther, keeping to thicker cover. He does not know why. An older hunter beside him grunts and says the deer always know something first. It is the job of people to catch up. The sun slides toward the western mounds. Long shadows reach across the Plaza like fingers. The chunky game ends with a shout and a slap on the back. Coins of shell change hands. Someone starts a drum, slow and steady, and a few dancers begin to move. The city seems eternal in this golden light. Nobody standing here can imagine the grass growing over it all. Yet the stories being traded, quiet and casual, already carry the first small cracks. Rise with me now, up through the wet morning air, and look down on the largest thing human hands ever built, north of Mexico, Monk's Mound. 100 feet tall, 14 acres at its base, a hill, made not by the earth but by people, one basket of dirt at a time. Over the course of 300 years, the mound has 4 terraces stacked like the steps of some sleeping giant. Its sides are steep and green, cloaked in summer grass, and its top is flat as a table. From up there, you can see clear across the American bottom, past the winding brown ribbon of the Mississippi, all the way to the bluffs on the horizon. On a still morning, the mist gathers in the low places between the smaller mounds, and the whole city looks like it is floating on a pale grey sea. The builders did not have wheels. They did not have pack animals. They carried each basket of clay and sand on their backs, one by one, walking the same worn paths for generations. Scholars have counted what it took, somewhere near 22 million cubic feet of earth, a lifetime of labor for thousands of people, spread across many lifetimes. A grandmother and her granddaughter both stooping to fill the same baskets, walking the same slope, watching the mound grow 1 handspan taller each season. At the very top, They built a great wooden building. It was long and wide, with cedar posts sunk deep into the packed earth. The roof was thatched, and smoke curled from inside on cold mornings. Nobody knows for certain what was said or done in that room, but the archaeologists who dug into the summit found the post holes still there, ghostly circles in the soil, marking where the walls once stood. Somebody lived up there. Or perhaps somebody ruled from up there. Or perhaps somebody simply spoke to the sky from up there, and the people below listened. Whoever he was, the man on top of Monk's Mound had a view no other person in ancient North America ever had. He stood higher than any king of Europe stood at the same moment. He looked out over a city of 10, maybe 20, maybe 40,000 people. He watched the sun rise over the great plaza. He watched the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires braid together in the still air. He watched traders come in from the north with copper on their backs, and from the south with shells strung on cord. The stories reach further back than him, though. Long before Monk's Mound rose to its full height, this bottomland already held smaller mounds, older villages, the bones of ancestors buried in careful rows. The people who chose this place chose it because others had chosen it first. The land itself remembered. The oxbow lakes, the black soil, the meeting of rivers, all of it had drawn human beings for thousands of years before the first basket of clay was ever set down. Some of the earliest mound builders on this continent lived far to the south, along the lower Mississippi, more than 5,000 years ago. Their descendants moved and mingled and passed on the knowledge of how to shape the earth. By the time Cahokia rose, mound building was already an old craft. The people who raised Monk's Mound were not inventing something new. They were perfecting something ancient. That is what makes the emptying of the city so strange to sit with. Cahokia was not a flash in the pan. It was the culmination of an art passed hand to hand across 100 generations. When its people finally walked away, they were not leaving a young place. They were leaving the crown jewel of a tradition older than most of the world's cities. Standing on the summit today, with the grass warm under your palm and the wind moving across the flat top, you can feel how deliberate all of it was. Every terrace measured, every slope angled to catch the light of certain sunrises. The mound points its long axis almost exactly north. Whoever designed it knew the sky, knew the seasons, knew where the sun would climb on the first day of summer and where it would fall on the shortest day of winter. And somewhere in the packed clay beneath your feet, layered like the pages of a book, are the older mounds this one was built on top of. A mound within a mound within a mound. Time folded into itself. The man on top was standing on the shoulders of everyone who came before, and beneath the grass, they were all still there, quietly holding him up. West of the great mound, past the flat sweep of the plaza, a farmer named Warren Whittree stood in a soft field one autumn morning in the early 1960s. His breath came out in small white clouds. Behind him, a bulldozer waited, patient as an ox. The state was building a new highway through the old Bottomlands, and Whittree had been sent to walk the ground before the blades came. He was an archaeologist, and his job that season was simple. Look at the dirt. See what the dirt would say. The dirt said something strange. When workers scraped back the topsoil, dark stains appeared in the pale clay below. Round stains. Deep ones. Each stain was about the size of a dinner plate, and they curved away from him in a long, gentle arc. Whittree crouched down and brushed the earth with his fingers. The stains were the ghosts of wooden posts, big posts. Trees, really. Cedar trees that had once stood taller than a house, sunk deep into the ground and then, long ago, pulled out or rotted away. What was left was only their shadow in the soil. He counted them. He measured the spaces between them. He walked the arc from one end to the other, boots crunching on frost-hard grass. And slowly, in the cold morning air, something began to take shape in his mind. The posts formed a perfect circle, a ring of giant timbers, hundreds of feet across, planted by people who had known exactly what they were doing. Witry went home that night and could not sleep. He spread his notes on the kitchen table. He drew the circle on graph paper. He marked where each post had stood, and then he marked something else. The center, a single post, set apart from the others, right in the middle of the ring. And when he drew a line from that center post out through one of the posts on the eastern arc, the line pointed to a spot on the horizon, a spot where, on a certain morning each year, the sun would rise. The spring equinox, the day when light and dark stand equal, the day when the fields wake up. He drew another line. This one pointed to the summer solstice sunrise, then another for the winter solstice. Every important Sunday of the year had a post waiting for it, like a finger raised to catch the first light. The Cahokians had built a calendar out of trees, a wooden clock, the size of a small town, laid flat against the prairie, keeping time by the turning of the sky. Witry named it Woodhenge, after the stone circle across the sea. The name stuck, but Woodhenge raised more questions than it answered. There was not one circle. There were at least 5, built one after the other on nearly the same spot, each one slightly different from the last. The Cahokians had torn down the old posts and put up new ones, again and again, over generations. Why? Was the calendar wrong the first time? Was it a ritual, the way some people rebuild an altar to keep it holy? Or was something else going on, something tied to a chief who died, or a season that failed, or a sky that no longer behaved the way it once had? Some researchers said the Woodhenges were purely practical. A farming city needs to know when to plant, when to harvest, when the floods will come and when the geese will fly. A circle of posts aligned to the sun would tell you all of that year after year, as reliable as a grandmother's memory. Others were not so sure. They pointed to the center post, and to the way certain sunrises would have lined up not just with the posts, but with the great bulk of Monk's Mound itself, rising in the east like a black wall against the pink dawn. On those mornings, the sun would seem to be born straight out of the mound, straight out of the ruler's house on top, as if the man up there commanded the sky to open, and it obeyed. That is not a calendar. That is a stage. That is theatre made of light and earth and pine. Witry kept digging for years. He found post pits, ash pits, offerings buried at the base of the timbers. He found charcoal from the cedar trees, hauled in from forests far to the north. Every answer he pulled from the ground brought 2 more questions with it. Who decided where the posts would stand? Who climbed them? Who watched? And who was watched? And when the city emptied, who took the knowledge of the sun circle with them, carrying it away like a candle in cupped hands? The people who dug into Cahokia's ground never expected to find what they found. They came looking for pottery and post holes. They came looking for the ordinary bones of an ordinary village. Instead, they lifted things from the dirt that made them sit back on their heels and stare at the sky. One old digger, working in the 1920s, wrote in his notebook about a copper sheet he uncovered near a burial. He said the metal was thin as birch bark and pounded smooth by hands that must have worked for weeks. When he brushed the last of the soil away, the copper caught the afternoon sun and threw a light so warm it looked like a small fire in his palm. He wrote that he almost expected it to be hot to the touch. It wasn't. It was cool as river stone, but he sat there a long time before he could put it in the box. That copper had traveled. Tests, done many years later, showed the metal came from the shores of Lake Superior, more than 700 miles north. Somebody had carried it down through forests and across rivers, trading it hand to hand, until it reached a craftsman at Cahokia who knew how to shape it. The digger, writing in plain pencil, said he kept thinking about the road that piece of copper had taken, a road nobody had mapped, a road that ran through country, now covered in highways and corn. Another worker, a young woman on a university crew in the 1960s, remembered pulling shell beads from a pit near the base of Monk's Mound. The beads were small and white, drilled through with a stone so fine she could not imagine the patience it took. She spread them on a cloth and counted more than 300 before she stopped. She said she felt, for a moment, like she was holding a necklace still warm from someone's neck. The shells had come from the Gulf of Mexico, from waters 1,000 miles south. She wrote in a letter to her mother that she could smell salt when she leaned close, though of course she couldn't. It had been 800 years, but she smelled it anyway. The old traders' roads did not survive the way Roman roads did. There is no pavement to walk, no milestones to read. What survived is the cargo: shark's teeth in the ground of Illinois, mica sheets from the mountains of North Carolina, charred blades from Oklahoma quarries, pipestone from Minnesota, each object a footprint of a footpath that once ran through the middle of the continent, tying Cahokia to the sea in one direction and the great cold lakes in the other. A ranger who worked the mounds in the 1980s told a visitor a story he did not often share. He said that on quiet mornings, standing on the plaza, he sometimes felt the ground under him, as though it were a floor with rooms below. He said he could almost see the traders coming in from every direction, their backs bent under bundles, their moccasins soft on the packed earth. He was not a mystic, he said. He was a man with a college degree and a pension, but he had walked that ground for 20 years, and it spoke to him in ways he could not quite explain to his wife over dinner. The mystery in these objects is not only where they came from, it is where they went. When Cahokia emptied the shells, and the copper scattered too, some ended up in graves hundreds of miles away, tucked beside the bones of people who lived generations after the city fell silent. A copper plate found in Georgia, a shell cup in Oklahoma, a carved stone pipe in the Dakotas, each one a small clue that the people who left Cahokia did not vanish into thin air. They walked. They carried what they could. They took the roads that had brought them the goods of half a continent, and they used those same roads to leave. But the roads themselves went quiet. The trade slowed. The great pulse that had pumped shell and copper and stone through the heart of North America grew weak, then weaker, and finally stopped. Whoever left, they left in smaller groups. They took different paths, and the objects they carried spread out like sparks from a scattered fire, glowing in 100 different places, but never again gathered into one bright center. That is what the witnesses in the ground still whisper. Not a shout, a hush, a promise that somewhere in some line of grandchildren, the roads of Cahokia are still being walked. Something strange happens when you spend enough time with Cahokia. The pieces begin to speak to each other. A pit dug in one spot lines up with a story told in another. A layer of ash matches a season noted in a third, and slowly, without you meaning it to, a pattern starts to rise out of the dirt like smoke from a slow fire. That pattern is food, feasting food. Not the small daily meals of a family gathered around a hearth, but the enormous open-air feeding of thousands upon thousands of people at once. The clearest sign of it sits east of Monk's Mound, in a spot the diggers call the Grand Plaza Pit. It looks, at first glance, like an ordinary hole in the ground. But when you stand at the edge and listen to the shovel workers tell what they pulled from it, the ordinary hole becomes something else. Deer bones by the thousands, whole deer, whole herds worth of them, killed and butchered in a single stretch of days. Layers of fish scales pressed into the clay like silver coins, charred maize kernels, squash rinds, and on top of it all, the smashed remains of pots, so large a grown man could climb inside. The pots are what stop you. They are not everyday pots, they are serving vessels. Huge dark bowls, glazed to a soft sheen, made to hold stew for 100 mouths at a time. The clay in them came from far away. Some of it traveled from the hills of southern Illinois. Some came from Missouri. Some came from farther still. Whoever cooked in those pots was cooking for a crowd that had arrived from the 4 directions. The diggers found the same pattern in pit after pit, deep pockets in the earth, full of the leavings of one enormous meal, then sealed over quickly, as if the whole plaza was cleaned up in a single morning. The bones lay in the order that butchering leaves them. Nothing had been dragged off by dogs. Nothing had weathered in the sun for weeks. The feast ended, the ground was covered, and the city moved on. Estimates for how many people ate at these gatherings sit in the tens of thousands. Some researchers say 7,000. Some say 15. Some go higher. The disagreement is real, and it is honest, because counting deer teeth in a pit and turning that into human mouths is a slow and careful math. But even the lowest number is staggering. 10,000 people fed at once in a place with no wheels and no draft animals to haul the food in, which means the food had to walk itself in. Deer were herded, driven, or hunted in coordinated sweeps of the forests for miles around. Fish were netted from the Mississippi in loads that took entire villages to bring ashore. Maize came in on the backs of runners moving up the roads to nowhere the surveyors keep finding. Salt came from the licks in the south. Persimmons and pawpaws came in baskets stacked head high. The dates on these feasts start to line up with things nobody expected them to line up with. The building of Monk's Mound goes in stages, and each stage seems to have a feast pit near it. New construction, new feast, new leader. Raised up on the summit, new feast. A great pole planted in the Woodhenge, another feast. It is as if every large act in the city was sealed with an act of shared eating, so enormous it left a scar in the ground. Even stranger, the feasts happen at the same seasons across different decades. Spring after the equinox, late summer at the corn harvest. The pits in different corners of the city hold the same mix of animals, killed in the same months, cooked in pots made 1,000 miles apart. Whoever ran the calendar in the Woodhenge was also running the calendar in the kitchens. Some scholars read this as the sign of a strong central hand, a ruler, a council, a priesthood, someone who could summon food and bodies on a schedule. Others read it the opposite way, as the sign of many peoples coming together by choice, each bringing what they had, all of them agreeing on when to arrive. In that second reading, Cahokia is not a kingdom at all. It is a fairground, a pilgrimage site, a place people travel to the way pilgrims travel to a shrine, and then went home again to their own quiet valleys. Both readings fit the bones in the pit. Neither one closes the case, and the pattern keeps rhyming quietly from one dig to the next, as if the city is still trying to tell you something it half remembers itself. In the summer of 1967, an archaeologist named Melvin Fowler stood on a low ridge just south of Monk's Mound and looked at a small hill nobody had paid much mind. It was one of dozens like it scattered across the old city. Gentle swells in the grass, easy to walk past. Locals called it Mound 72. It didn't rise like a temple. It didn't square off like a platform. It sat low and quiet, shaped a little like a loaf of bread left in the field. Fowler brought his shovels and his brushes and his students, and he began slowly to open the earth. He worked the way careful people work with old things, a layer at a time. A cup of soil, a sift of screen, and then, under the grass, he found the story. The first thing he found was a man. The man lay on his back, on a bed of shell beads, 20,000 of them, maybe more, cut from the lips of ocean conchs, hauled up from the Gulf, 1,000 miles away. The beads had been sewn onto a cape or a blanket, and they'd been arranged into the shape of a great bird, wings spread wide beneath his body, a head pointed one way, a tail the other. When the beads settled into place, the man was resting on the outstretched wings of a falcon made of seashell. Under that shell bird lay a second man facing the first, and around them lay offerings so rich they still take the breath from anyone who reads the list. Sheets of hammered copper folded like linen, piles of mica from the mountains of the Carolinas, thin as glass, shining like frozen water. Hundreds of unused arrow points, some made of stone from Oklahoma, some from Wisconsin, some from Tennessee, laid out in careful bundles as if a warrior had gathered every corner of the country and set it at his feet. Off to one side of the beaded man lay another bundle, not treasure this time. People, 4 men, arms linked at the shoulder, heads missing, hands missing, as if placed there to serve some duty that required no face and no touch. Beyond them, in a long, narrow pit, more than 50 young women lay side by side in 2 neat rows, all about the same age, arranged with the kind of care you give to something precious. There were more pits, more rows, more bodies. By the time Fowler and those who came after him had finished counting, Mound 72 held the remains of more than 260 people, most of them buried in a single ceremony, most of them buried around that beaded birdman-like petals around the center of a flower. Nobody knows his name. Nobody knows what he ruled or what he meant. But the story the ground tells is the story of a man so important that a city stopped its work to send him into the next world with an entire continent laid at his feet. Archaeologists call him the Birdman. In the art of Cahokia, the Birdman is everywhere. He appears on carved stone tablets with a beaked mask over his face and wings folded at his back. He appears on copper plates hammered so thin you could read a page through them, showing a dancer in a falcon costume, 1 foot lifted, 1 arm raised, caught mid-flight between the world above and the world below. The people of the Mississippi seemed to believe that a great warrior could put on the feathers of a falcon and cross into the sky, and that in the sky he might become something more than a man. The bird bed in Mound 72 is the closest thing we may ever find to that story made real. 2 men laid together in the shape of a falcon, the wings of shell, holding them like a nest. Whatever the ceremony meant to the people who dug that pit and filled it, they meant it with all the strength they had. And here is where the mystery sharpens, quiet as a drawn breath, because whoever the Birdman was, whoever the young women were, whoever the headless attendants were, they lived in the earliest, brightest years of Cahokia. They died when the city was rising. They were buried when the Plaza was new, and the mounds were still growing, and the fires on Monk's Mound burned every night. The people who could bury a king this way built a city meant to last 1,000 years, and still, in only a few generations, all of them were gone. That is the shape of the puzzle. A Civilization powerful enough to lay a man on a bed of 20,000 shells. And then, somehow, powerful enough to disappear. The strangest part of the beaded burial is not the shells, or the copper, or the 20,000 ocean beads shaped like a great falcon under the bones. The strangest part is that whoever was laid there did not lie there alone. Around that grave, and stacked into the same mound, workers found more bodies, many more. Some had been buried with care, others had been placed together in long rows, and the rows keep going deeper than a person expects earth to hold. Now, this is where the story turns from plain history into something closer to a whispered legend, because the pattern of these graves suggests something the old textbooks did not want to say out loud. It suggests a family, a line, a house of people who ruled Cahokia the way old kings ruled distant lands, not chiefs chosen fresh each season, not headmen picked by council, a bloodline, passed from parent to child, like a lit torch handed down a long dark hall. You can almost see it if you stand on the grass above Mound 72 at dusk. The soft light lays across the flat top, like honey poured slow. The wind moves through the prairie grass, with a sound like paper turning, and below your feet, in the cool packed clay, the bones of a family that may have held this whole city in the palm of one hand. Nobody knows their names. Nobody knows what tongue they spoke at their own dinner fires. But the pattern hums under the ground like a low note on a drum. Some researchers look at the burial and see something even stranger. They see a pairing. Two central figures laid back to back, with the great beaded falcon spread between them like a shared blanket of shell. One of them may have been a man. One may have been a woman. Or the shapes may have meant something else entirely. Something we no longer have the words to hold. Some think this was a founding pair, a first mother and first father of the ruling house. Others think it was a reenactment, a memory pressed into the ground, of a story already old when Cahokia was young. Around them, offerings, copper sheets beaten thin as a leaf, long shafts of arrows, tied in careful bundles, each pointed a different direction, as if to mark every road out of the city. Piles of mica that shimmered like still water when the torches passed, and more human beings laid in careful arrangement, as though the burial itself were a small city mirroring the great one above. The word most often whispered around this find is dynasty. It is a word borrowed from far-off empires, from Egypt, from China, from the courts of medieval Europe, and that borrowing is exactly what makes so many researchers uneasy, because the story North America has long been told about itself is that no such houses ever rose here. No throne rooms, no royal families, only villages and councils and open plains. Cahokia keeps refusing that story. It keeps offering, instead, this quiet, patient evidence that a line of blood may have sat at the top of a pyramid of earth and watched the sun climb over the Mississippi. If that is true, then the vanishing becomes even stranger, because a ruling family does not simply melt into the grass. A ruling family has heirs, cousins, attendants, storytellers, who remember every name back 10 generations. When a village falls apart, memory scatters like sparks. But when a house falls, memory sometimes travels intact, carried on the tongues of the survivors, sung into the ears of children in some other valley far away. So the impossible detail is this: somewhere out there, in a long chain of grandmothers and grandfathers, whose faces we will never see, the memory of that beaded burial may have kept traveling, passed from one fire to the next, softened, changed, dressed in new words, waiting in a song that sounds, to modern ears, like nothing more than an old lullaby. Or it may have ended in that grave, the last torch snuffed, the last name unspoken, the line closing like a door in a dark hall. The mound does not tell you which. It only lies there, quiet under the Illinois sky, holding its shells and its bones and its beaten copper. And when the wind turns just right and the crickets rise in the tall grass, you can almost hear the shape of a question, a family, a city, a vanishing, and the long, slow silence that came after, thick and gentle as fog, rolling off the river at dawn. Not everyone who studies Cahokia believes the story of a great vanishing. Some scholars look at the same mounds, the same broken pottery, the same layers of black soil, and they see something quieter. They see a slow shift, a gentle draining, a city that lost its shine the way a lantern loses its oil, one drop at a time. To them there is no mystery worth chasing. There is only farming, weather, and the ordinary tiredness of people worn down by hard years. The skeptics have good ground to stand on. They point to the soil itself, that thick, dark bottomland that once grew corn taller than a child. Ancient pollen tucked in the mud tells a story of change. Around the year 1150, the rains began to shift. The summers grew stubborn. The rivers ran too high one year and too low the next. A city of tens of thousands cannot eat a promise. It needs kernels in the basket by autumn, and baskets full again the year after. Imagine the fields around Cahokia in a bad summer. The corn stalks stand pale and dry, their leaves curling like old paper. The bean vines hang limp on their poles. The squash sits small and hard on the ground, no bigger than a closed fist. A farmer walks the rows in the yellow evening light, kneeling now and then to feel the cracked clay. She knows what her mother knew. She knows what her grandmother knew. And this year, the ground has forgotten them both. The skeptics say, this is enough. A city that big, they argue, lives on the edge of hunger, even in fat years. Cut the harvest by a third, and families begin to leave. Cut it by half, and whole neighborhoods empty. There is no need for war, no need for plague, no need for wonder. Just weather, just soil, just the slow arithmetic of empty bowls. They point to the trees too. Cahokia burned wood by the ton. Every roof beam, every palisade post, every cooking fire came from the forests along the bluffs. Charcoal studies show those forests thinning as the centuries passed. The good oaks fell first, then the hickories, then whatever else would burn. A family that once walked a short path to gather firewood now walked half a day. Multiply that by 10,000 households, and the math turns cruel. The skeptics stack these facts like stones in a wall. Bad harvests, thin forests, silted creeks, floods that swallowed the low fields and droughts that starved the high ones. They say the answer is sitting right there in the dirt, plain as a broken pot, and anyone looking for something stranger is looking for magic where only mud remains. And they have a point. They have several points. The climate did shift, the forest did thin, the rivers did move. The people of Cahokia did face real grinding trouble that grew worse with every passing generation. To ignore that would be to lie about the land. But then the skeptics come to the gap, and the gap is where their voices grow softer, because farming failures usually leave a trail. Villages shrink. People move a few miles down the river and try again. The bones in the graves show signs of hunger, thin ribs, and weak teeth and stunted growth. A city dies slowly and leaves behind 100 smaller towns, like a candle breaking into sparks. Cahokia did not do that. Cahokia emptied, the whole region emptied. By the year 1400, the bottomlands around the great mounds held almost no one at all. Not a scattered farmstead, not a stubborn village clinging to the old plaza, nothing. An area the size of a small country simply went silent, and it stayed silent for hundreds of years until European travelers finally wandered through and found only grass and mounds and deer trails. Bad weather does not do that. Thin forests do not do that. Even hunger, terrible as it is, tends to leave stragglers behind. Someone always stays. Someone always tries again. In Cahokia, no one tried again. That is the thing the skeptics cannot quite explain. They can explain why the city weakened. They can explain why families left. They cannot explain why nobody came back. They cannot explain why the richest bottomland in the middle of the continent, black soil, deep as a grave, sat unfarmed for 400 years, while other peoples farmed thinner ground 100 miles away. Something more than weather turned those fields into a place people would not touch. The skeptics know it. They just cannot name it, and that unnamed thing is where the mystery begins again. Around the year 1175, the people of Cahokia did something strange. They cut down 20,000 trees, big trees, straight oak and hickory, tall as houses, each one hauled from the forests that ringed the bottomlands. They stripped the bark, they shaped the trunks, then they drove them upright into the earth in a great ring around the heart of the city, a wooden wall 2 miles long, 15 feet high, studded with watchtowers set every 70 feet or so, like teeth on a comb. Nobody agrees on why. The archaeologists who dug into the post holes could not miss what they were looking at. Deep pits, thick timbers, bastions built for defenders to stand on and see out. This was not a fence to keep deer from the corn. This was the kind of wall a people build when they believe something is coming for them. And they built it fast. The evidence in the soil suggests the whole ring went up in a matter of months, maybe a single season. Then, a generation later, they tore it down and built it again. And again, 4 times by some counts. 4 times the same enormous ring of oak rose out of the flat, black earth. The believers, the ones who have spent decades brushing dirt off these post molds with dental picks and soft brushes, will tell you plainly something changed at Cahokia. Something scared them, and whatever it was, it scared them enough to spend the labor of thousands of people over and over to keep it out. The strange part is what the wall enclosed. It did not wrap the whole city. It did not protect the farm fields or the outer neighborhoods where most people slept. It cut right through the middle of town, sealing off Monk's Mound and the Grand Plaza and the ceremonial heart from the rest. Homes on the outside, temples on the inside. Some houses were even torn down to make room for the timbers. That detail is the one that makes the believers lean forward, because it means the wall was not built against strangers coming down the river from far away. It was built between the people at the top and the people who lived below them, or so one reading goes. The competing view is quieter and just as stubborn. Some researchers look at the same post holes and see something else entirely. A screen, not a fortress, a boundary that marked sacred ground from ordinary ground, a wall to hide holy rituals from common eyes, the way curtains hide an altar. The bastions in this reading were not for archers. They were platforms for drummers, for singers, for the men and women who called the sun up over the mounds each morning. Both sides are certain. Both sides have walked the ground, measured the timbers, counted the char marks where fire kissed the wood. Both sides will tell you, with the calm of people who have looked long and hard, that they know what they are looking at. And both sides admit the wall did not save the city, because whatever it was built to hold out or hold in, the city still emptied. The timbers rotted in place, the watchtowers, if that is what they were, fell one by one into the tall grass. Nobody replaced them a fifth time. The people who had raised those 20,000 trees stopped raising anything at all. The believers say the wall is the loudest thing Cahokia ever whispered. A city at peace does not build such a thing. A city sure of itself does not tear down its neighbors' homes to make room for a barricade. Something split the place from the inside. Maybe hunger. Maybe a fight between clans. Maybe a priest-king who lost the faith of his people and tried to hide behind oak until the trouble passed. Others push back. They point out that many great cities in many parts of the world built walls in their prime, not their decline. Rome did, Constantinople did. A wall can be a symbol as much as a shield. It can say we are important enough to be walled. It can say the sacred lives here and the ordinary lives there. The truth sits somewhere in the timbers, and the timbers are gone. Only the shadows they left in the earth remain, dark stains in the pale clay, spaced with a discipline that still impresses anyone who kneels down to look. 20,000 trees, 4 times raised, then abandoned to rot beneath a sky that no longer had a city under it. Whatever the wall meant, the people who built it took its meaning with them when they walked away. The land around Cahokia remembers what people cannot. Walk the Bottomlands today, and the ground itself will tell you stories older than any book. Her soil holds layers like pages, and each page is a season the city lived through. Some pages are dark with flood mud, some are pale with drought dust, and some are burned. Scientists who study old climates read those pages the way you might read a diary. They pull long cores of dirt from the ground. They study rings inside ancient tree stumps buried in the muck. They pick apart pollen grains no bigger than a speck of flour. From all these tiny witnesses, a picture rises, and the picture is not a calm one. For a long time, the weather over the Mississippi Valley was kind. The medieval warm period brought steady rains and long growing seasons. Corn ripened, tall and heavy. Squash swelled fat along the vines. Beans climbed the corn stalks like green ropes. This was the weather that let Cahokia grow into a city. Sunshine built those mounds as surely as human hands did. Then slowly, the sky changed its mind. Around the middle of the 1100s, tree rings begin to pinch tight. Tight rings mean thirsty trees. Thirsty trees mean thin harvests. The rain came less often, and when it came wrong. Sometimes too little, sometimes too much, all at once. Farmers who once planted with confidence started planting with prayer. The Mississippi did not sit still either. Rivers in the Bottomlands wander like sleepy snakes. They cut new paths through soft earth. They swallow old fields and spit out new ones a mile away. Old maps drawn from buried channels show that the great river shifted more than once during Cahokia's last century. A creek that fed a neighborhood might dry up in a single spring. A field that fed a family might drown in a single storm. You can still see the ghosts of those old waters if you know where to look. In the flat farmland around the mounds, faint curves show up in aerial photos. They look like pale scars in the green. Those scars are dead riverbeds, places where water once ran and no longer does. The land holds the shape of what used to be, the way a pillow holds the shape of a head long after the sleeper has gone. There are other quiet clues out there too. Certain patches of ground refuse to grow the same trees as the fields beside them. Farmers around Collinsville have long noticed that some old plots seem tired, worn thin, as if the soil itself is remembering too much work. Oaks grew crooked in places where researchers later found buried house floors. Cottonwoods lean away from spots where old palisade posts once stood. The land keeps a kind of memory in its roots. Animals seem to know too. Hunters and hikers who spend real time in the Bottomland tell of meadows deer will not cross, foxes that skirt certain low mounds, owls that call from one grove but never the next. There is no science in these stories, only the long attention of people who watch the country closely. Still, the pattern shows up too often to shrug off entirely. The sky above Cahokia grew restless in those late years. Ice cores drawn from far-off glaciers record volcanic dust from eruptions on the other side of the world. That dust would have dimmed the sun over Illinois. Summers would have felt cool and grey. Winters would have bitten harder. A city that fed 10,000 mouths on corn and squash cannot easily survive a cool summer, much less a string of them. Some researchers point to a great earthquake along the New Madrid Fault, sometime in Cahokia's final century. The Bottomlands sit right on top of that sleeping giant. A hard shake would have cracked walls, tilted mounds, and turned wet ground to something like pudding. Other researchers say the evidence for such a quake is thin, and that the city was already fading before the earth moved. Both sides agree the ground beneath Cahokia was never quite as steady as it looked. Stand there now on a grey afternoon, and you can almost feel it. The wind moves across the plaza with a low hush. The grass leans one way, then the other. Puddles gather in odd rings that trace foundations no longer there. The land is not haunted, exactly. It is only remembering the way an old dog remembers a hand that used to feed it. Whatever happened to the people of Cahokia? The ground beneath their feet was already turning strange. The rivers were moving, the rains were failing, the skies were unsteady, and the city, patient as it was, could only hold on for so long. The first families likely started leaving before anyone noticed. That is how these things usually go. A cousin here, a grown daughter there, a whole household loading its dogs and its bundles onto a canoe. One grey morning in early spring. No drums, no speeches, just the soft slap of paddles against the Mississippi and a slow drift downstream towards somewhere quieter. If you look across the map of old America, you find this same slow leaving over and over again. Different rivers, different names carved into different stones, the same soft draining away of a great city into the countryside around it. It is one of the oldest patterns on this continent, and Cahokia is only the largest example. Think of Chaco Canyon out in the high desert of New Mexico, a place of long straight roads and stone great houses stacked like pale honeycomb against red cliffs. For 200 years the people there built and traded and watched the stars from carefully placed windows. Then the rains changed, the corn thinned, and the families packed up their turquoise and their pottery and simply walked away, north toward the mesas, south toward the little rivers. Their descendants live there still, in the pueblos of Hopi and Zuni and Acoma, keeping stories that reach back to the canyon like roots reaching for old water. Or think of Mesa Verde, tucked into its sandstone alcoves in Colorado. Whole towns built into the cliff face, with towers and kivas and ladders climbing between them like the rungs of some strange dream. The people there lived through drought after drought. They fought sometimes. They prayed often. And in the late 1300s they emptied their rooms and drifted south, blending into the Pueblo peoples who welcomed them along the Rio Grande. You see it in the eastern woodlands too. The Hopewell earthworks of Ohio, those great geometric circles and squares, laid out in green fields, rose to their glory a full 1,000 years before Cahokia. Then, over a few slow generations, the ceremonial fires went cold. The mound building stopped. The people did not vanish. They spread and thinned and became the ancestors of many later nations, but the grand centers stood empty, waiting for the grass. There is something almost gentle in this pattern, not the crash of an empire, but the quiet unwinding of one. A city breathes out its people, the way a lake gives off mist at dawn. Cahokia seems to have breathed out this same way. The archaeologists dig through the layers and find that the outer neighborhoods emptied first. Farmhouses on the edges fell silent, while the central plaza still saw torches at night. Then the mid-ring hollowed. Then the last households, near Monk's Mound, packed their pots and their memories and stepped onto the trails leading north, along the Illinois, south along the Mississippi, west into the prairie grass. Some researchers believe you can trace their footprints, faintly, in the pottery that begins appearing far from the city in the 1200s and early 1300s. New styles bloom along the upper Mississippi. New villages rise on bluffs in Wisconsin and Iowa, where no villages stood before. These are the sites archaeologists call Wanota. Some scholars see Cahokia's children in that pottery. Others see local peoples who simply borrowed a few ideas from travelers passing through. The clay does not speak clearly enough to settle the argument. Farther south, along the Arkansas and the lower Mississippi, other mound centers grew larger in the same decades when Cahokia grew smaller. Places like Parkin and Nordena, and the towns the Spanish would later stumble across when Hernando de Soto came marching through in the 1540s. Some of those southern towns may have swelled because refugees from the north arrived carrying baskets and children, and the memory of a bigger city they had left behind. Others may have grown on their own, for their own reasons, with no thread tying them back to Cahokia at all. The truth, most likely, is that the first families slipped away in many directions at once, some to cousins upriver, some to trading partners downriver, some to strangers on the plains who took them in for the sake of an old alliance. A great city does not empty into one place. It empties into 100 places, the way a shattered pot spreads its shards across a whole floor. And so the pattern holds. Chaco, Mesa Verde, Hopewell, Cahokia, each a bright gathering, each a slow scattering. The land keeps the mounds, the people keep the stories, and the roads between them run quiet under the moon. The Grand Plaza did not empty in one night. It emptied the way a lake evaporates in a long dry summer, so slowly that you could stand in the middle of it for years and never quite see the water going down. But the ground remembers, and the things people left behind, the small forgotten pieces pressed into the dark earth, still speak in a low steady voice to anyone patient enough to listen. Walk the plaza now, and you walk on 40 acres of flat black soil. It looks like an ordinary meadow. Grass, wind, a few benches, but dig a spade into that soil and the story starts to change. Down beneath the roots, in layer after careful layer, the archaeologists have pulled up broken pottery, chipped stone, burnt corn, and the small bones of fish and deer. In the older layers, the layers from the city's shining years, the pieces come thick and busy. Cook fires, feast pits, shattered bowls painted with fine dark lines, the rubble of 1,000 meals shared under a summer sky. Then, as the digging climbs upward through time, the pieces thin out, not all at once, just a little less in each layer. Fewer bones, fewer sherds, fewer of the shells straighted up from the warm Gulf, The soil grows quieter, like a room where the voices are leaving one by one. You can hold one of those sherds in your hand today. It is smaller than a playing card. The clay is the color of old bread crust, and along one edge you can still see the print of a woman's thumb where she pressed the wet coil into shape 800 years ago. She lived in the good years. Her thumbprint is a signature written before the emptying began. The tools tell the same slow story. In the early Plaza layers, the flint chips are everywhere. Small bright flakes struck from cores, brought in from far-off quarries. Chunks of galena, that heavy silver grey stone the Cahokians ground into shining paint. Beads of copper hammered thin as leaves. Then, in the later layers, the exotic things grow rare. The copper is gone. The Gulf shells are gone. The trade roads have gone quiet. And the plaza, which once glittered with goods from 1,000 miles in every direction, begins to look like a country town, making do with what it has. Around the edges of the plaza, the houses tell it too. The older house floors are packed hard, worn smooth by generations of bare feet. Fire hearths sit in the middle, ringed with cooking stones around them, the small dropped treasures of daily life. A bone needle, a child's clay bead, a broken pipe carved into the shape of a frog. Then, above those floors, comes a strange thing. Some houses were burned before they were left. The posts were pulled from the ground. The roofs collapsed inward. The families cleaned their hearths, gathered their belongings, and set the walls on fire behind them as they walked away. Not all the houses, just some, and not all at once, just here and there, across the neighborhoods, like lamps going out one by one, along a long street. You can see the char lines in the soil today, black ribbons running through the yellow clay. Archaeologists call them burn horizons. They are the fingerprints of leaving a family, choosing not to let the next family live in their walls. A ceremony, perhaps, a closing of a door that was meant to stay closed. What is missing from the Lake Plaza is almost as loud as what remains. There are fewer of the great feasting pits, those enormous holes packed with deer bone and broken serving bowls that once fed thousands under the summer stars. There are fewer signs of the huge public works, the plaza resurfacings, and the mound raisings that used to happen like clockwork every generation. The city is still alive, but it is smaller, thinner, quieter, a great house, with most of its rooms shut up for the winter. And yet the plaza never became a ruin in the way we picture ruins. No collapsed columns, no dramatic fire, just the soft, steady arithmetic of subtraction. One family gone, then another, then a whole ridge of houses standing empty, their gardens going to weed, their post holes filling slowly with rain. Somewhere in that slow emptying is the answer to where they went. The sherds and the char lines and the missing copper cannot say it plainly, but they can say this much. The people did not run. They packed, they cleaned, they burned their doorways behind them, and they walked in small groups into a country that was waiting to receive them. Inside the Longhouses of Cahokia, the fires kept burning even as the plaza grew quiet. That is where the story really lives. Not in the great mound, not in the empty ball courts, but in the small rooms where families still cooked their evening meals and passed cups of black drink from hand to hand. Picture one of those homes near the end. The walls are woven from bent saplings and packed with clay, the roof thatched with river grass, gone silver from years of rain. Inside, the air smells of wood smoke and cornmeal, and the sharp green scent of drying herbs hung from the rafters. A grandmother sits closest to the coals. Her hands move through a basket of dried beans, sorting the good from the bad, and her voice moves through a story her own grandmother told her. She talks about the days when the plaza was full, when the drums shook the ground and copper flashed on the chests of the chiefs. She tells the little ones how their family used to have a place along the ridge, close to the mound where the sun priests climbed. She tells them the name of the aunt who danced at the summer feast, and the cousin who painted the pots with the swirling water lines, and the uncle who could read the shadows of the Woodhenge and know when to plant. The children listen. They do not remember any of it. To them the great plaza is a wide grass field where deer come to graze at dusk. The mound is a hill they climb to watch the clouds. The stories are like songs about a country they have never seen, even though they were born inside its bones. This is how a city dies. Not all at once. It dies in the telling and the not telling. It dies in the small choices families make around their fires. Do we stay another winter? Do we plant one more spring? Do we follow the cousins who left last year down the river toward the place they said the fish still ran thick? Archaeologists find these last homes and read them carefully. They see hearths that were used, cleaned and used again. They see mended pots and patched roofs and floors swept smooth. These were not people fleeing in panic. These were people living, cooking supper, raising babies, arguing about which way to go and when. The stories change as they travel. A grandmother in a longhouse at Cahokia tells her granddaughter about the copper plates and the falcon dancer. That granddaughter grows up and marries into a village 100 miles north, along a bluff above the Mississippi. She tells her own children the story. But now the falcon dancer has become a bird spirit who taught the people to plant corn. The city has become a shining place in the old times, before the Troubles. 2 generations later, in a village of round bark houses, far up a tributary, the great-great-grandchildren tell a story about a place their ancestors came from. A place with mounds tall as clouds and a plaza wide as the sky. They cannot say exactly where it was. They only know it was south, and it was long ago, and their people were once part of something bigger than the small circle of fields they now tend. You can hear these echoes in the oral traditions carried by Siouan-speaking peoples across the plains and river valleys. The Osage, the Ponca, the Omaha, the Kansa, the Quapaw. Their old stories speak of a time when the people lived together in the east, along a great river, before they scattered. Some scholars listen to these stories and hear Cahokia in them. Others say the connection cannot be proven, that the migrations described could refer to many places and many times. Both may be right, both may be wrong. The stories were never meant to be maps. What we do know is that stories carry farther than pots and copper. A family may leave everything behind when they walk away from a city. The heavy grinding stones, the bulky baskets, the clay jars that would only crack on the road. But they carry the stories. They tuck them into their sleeves and hum them under their breath as they walk, and they set them down again by whatever fire they light next. So when you wonder where the people of Cahokia went, remember that some part of them went into the telling, into the grandmother sorting beans, into the granddaughter far downstream, into a child in a bark house on a cold night, listening to a story about a place with a mound so tall it touched the sky. Step back from all of it now. Step back from the debates and the theories, from the pottery shards and the pollen counts, from the arguments about droughts and diseases and wooden walls. Set them down for a moment like a lantern on the ground, because underneath all that noise, there is a quieter truth waiting. Something happened here. Something mattered here to people whose names we will never learn. That much is not in question. You cannot pile up 60 feet of earth, one basket at a time, without meaning. You cannot mark the turning of the sun with cedar posts. Unless the sun means something to you, you cannot bury a young man on a bed of 20,000 shell beads and call it an accident of history. Whatever Cahokia was, it was loved. That word feels strange next to the science, next to the maps and the carbon dates, but it fits. People carried river clay in their hands for generations to build those mounds. They walked barefoot across a plaza they had swept smooth for their grandchildren. They stood on the flat top of the great mound at dusk and watched the light drain out of the bottomlands like wine poured from a cup. Somewhere in all of that, they were home. Picture the last torch on Monk's Mound. Nobody knows if there was one. Nobody wrote it down. But imagine it anyway, because the imagining is closer to the truth than the arguing. A single flame at the top of the tallest earthwork north of Mexico. A person standing beside it, cupping the light against a soft wind coming off the river. Below them, the plaza is quiet. The longhouses are dark. The paths that once carried 10,000 feet in a single morning are empty as riverbeds in a dry year. The person on the mound is not afraid. That is important to say. In the stories we tell about endings, we always add fear, because we cannot imagine an ending without it. But endings in real life are often softer than that. They come the way autumn comes. One morning the leaves are green. A month later they are gold. A month after that they are gone, and the tree stands quiet. And the tree is not afraid. Maybe it was like that. Maybe the last families to leave did not run. Maybe they folded their blankets and packed their pots and closed the door of a lodge they had lived in all their lives and walked out into a morning that smelled like wood smoke and wet grass. Maybe they turned back once at the edge of the fields to look at the shape of the great mound against the sky, and maybe they said a word we would not understand and kept walking. That word is the thing we are chasing. That word is what all the researchers are really trying to translate. Not just where they went, but what they carried with them when they went. A memory, a grandmother's song, a way of holding a bowl, a story about a birdman with outstretched wings, a story about a woman who was buried with her sisters on a mound built for the sun. Those things travel farther than pottery. Those things travel farther than bones. And here is the quiet truth underneath the mystery. Even if we never prove which people are Cahokia's direct descendants, even if the isotope maps stay fuzzy and the oral traditions stay guarded and the ceramic patterns keep leading in 3 directions at once, something of that place did not vanish. It could not have. Human beings do not shed a home the way a snake sheds skin. They carry it in gestures, in prayers, in the shape of the words they use for river and corn and sky. Somewhere, right now, a child is being taught to plant a seed in a way that was taught to a grandparent, who was taught by a grandparent, going back and back down a line of hands. And somewhere in that line, maybe, a pair of hands once patted river clay onto the side of a mound in Illinois. We cannot draw the line, but the line is there. The last torch on Monk's Mound did not really go out. It got smaller, it moved, it traveled with the people who loved it, and it became a half fire in a lodge 100 miles away, and then a cooking fire on a prairie, and then a candle on a table, and then a story told at night to somebody's grandchild who did not yet know what a mound was. The flame changed shape. The flame kept going. That is a truth quieter than any theory, and older than any of them. Stand still for a moment. The grass under your boots is cool and slightly damp, and the sky above the old city is the deep blue that comes just after the last light drains from the west. You are on the flat ground east of Monk's Mound, and the great earthen shape rises in front of you like a sleeping animal. The stars are coming out one by one. The air smells of river mud, wet clay, and the sweet green scent of prairie grass that has been warm all day and is now cooling down. Listen. The sound you hear first is the wind. It moves across the top of the mound and comes down the long slope in slow waves, brushing the grass with a sound like someone drawing a hand across old cloth. Somewhere out past the plaza, a killdeer calls once and goes quiet. The Mississippi River is not far, and if you turn your head just right, you can hear it. A low, steady breath, the sound of a country moving south in the dark. The moon is not up yet. That makes the stars brighter than you are used to. They spread over the bottomlands like grains scattered on a black cloth. If you stayed here long enough, you would see them wheel, slow as a wagon turning, and you would understand why the old builders raised their wooden posts to catch that turning. The circle is gone now. The posts are dust, but the sky they watched has not changed. Beneath your feet, somewhere in the packed clay, are the roads. They ran out from this place in every direction, straight as arrows, wide as village streets. Some went north toward the copper country. Some went east toward the shell coasts. Some slipped west into the tall grass, and some followed the river south into cane and cypress. Tonight, all of those roads are grass and shadow. The people who walked them are gone, and no one knows for sure which road took them. That is the quiet fact that keeps this place alive in the mind. Tens of thousands of feet, over years or maybe over decades, left this ground. They carried babies wrapped in soft hide. They carried grandmothers, pots, dried corn, small bundles of bone, from those they could not leave behind. They walked out along these roads under skies not unlike the one over you now, and they became other people, in other places, with other names. Somewhere out in the dark, in the direction of a light you cannot see, their great-great-grandchildren are sleeping. The mound in front of you is huge, even in this low blue light. You can feel its size the way you feel a barn or a bluff. 60 feet tall, 14 acres at the base. It was built by hand, one basket of earth at a time, by people who lived and died and never saw it finished. Standing near it at night, you understand something you did not understand in daylight. It was not made to be looked at. It was made to be a place from which to look, a stage for the man or woman who spoke to the sky, a stair for the sun. A cricket starts up close to your ankle, and then another, and then the whole plain is quietly singing. The sound is small and even and endless. Fireflies rise out of the grass. 1, then 3, then a dozen, drifting low over the plaza where the great ball game was played. The lights are the same yellow-green they have always been. If a child from the old city stood next to you, she would know them. She would put out her hand. You are very small here. The plaza in front of Monk's Mound is bigger than most modern town squares. The city that once surrounded it stretched for miles in every direction. Houses and gardens and smoke, and voices. You feel that emptiness. Now, not as sadness, but as space, room to think. Room for the wind to work, room for the stars to fall through. Without hitting anything, the question of where they went is still in your chest, gentle as a stone in a pocket. Down which road? Toward which river? Into which people? The night does not answer. It only holds the question, the way the mound holds the earth, patient and unhurried. Somewhere far off, a coyote laughs once and stops. The grass keeps moving, the stars keep turning. The great dark shape of Monk's Mound stands over the bottomlands like something waiting to be spoken to. You breathe in, you breathe out, and the old city breathes with you, slow and steady, keeping its long, kind secret under the sky. Follow the river south from the empty mounds, and the story does not end. It only quiets. It spreads out. It slips into the water like ink into a pitcher, until the whole current carries a little bit of Cahokia inside it. That is the shape of the legacy left behind. Not one place, not one people. A long ribbon of cousins waiting downriver, each carrying a piece of the old city in their pots, their planting songs, their stories about the sun. By the time the last torch went dark on Monk's Mound, the Mississippi already knew every family who had left. The river had watched them load their canoes with dried corn and copper beads. It had felt their paddles dip and pull. Downstream, in the wide Bottomlands where the Arkansas meets the Mississippi, new towns were rising. They had smaller mounds. They had painted pots with familiar swirls. Some of these places grew strong for another 200 years, humming with markets and games and priest houses, as if a spark from the great city had drifted south and caught in fresh grass. Archaeologists call these downriver places by many names: Nodina, Parkin, Menard, Quapaw ancestors, some scholars say, Tunica ancestors, others answer. The pottery leans one way, the house shapes lean another. The truth may be a braid of many strands, because Cahokia was never one people to begin with. It was a gathering, and a gathering, when it breaks apart, does not leave one trail. It leaves dozens. Follow the Illinois River north instead, and you find a different set of cousins. The Wanota tradition rose in the upper Mississippi Valley as Cahokia faded. Their pots were shell-tempered like Cahokian ware. Their villages sat along the same drainages. Some researchers see clear inheritance there, one culture handing its tools to the next. Others see a rival tradition that simply moved into empty rooms. Both views live inside the same museum cases, staring at the same broken bowls, disagreeing politely across the glass. The land around the great mounds changed too. The palisade wood rotted. The plazas grew over. Deer came back to graze where 10,000 people had once eaten fish stew at midsummer. French traders paddling the American bottom in the 17th century found only quiet grass and strange hills. They asked the local people who had built them. The answers they got were careful. Sometimes the mounds belonged to giants, sometimes to a forgotten grandfather people, sometimes to no one anyone remembered. The silence around the question was itself a kind of memory. Something grew in that silence, a way of holding the past that only the peoples of the mid-continent seem to carry. You find it in Osage prayers that speak of a great town where the sky met the earth. You find it in Ho-Chunk songs about a red-horn hero who walks between worlds. You find it in Digiha traditions that trace the tribes down the Ohio and out across the plains, splitting like a hand of fingers from one closed fist. Each story points, in its own quiet way, back toward the Bottomlands. Each stops short of naming the city outright. That reserve is not forgetting. It is the shape a memory takes when a place has become sacred and painful at the same time. Modern towns near the mounds have their own small traditions. The people of Collinsville and East St. Louis grow up with Monk's Mound on the horizon like a green whale surfacing above the highway. Children climb its wooden stairs on school trips. Old men walk their dogs along the plaza at dusk. Every August, drummers gather at the site for a heritage festival, and the low, steady beat rolls across the flat ground, the way it must have rolled 1,000 years ago. Nobody there claims to know exactly what the drums are calling back. They only know the calling feels right. Downriver, upriver, across the plains, in the pine woods of Oklahoma and the lake country of Wisconsin, there are families who suspect the great city is part of their own story. Some say it openly, some hold the possibility gently, the way you hold a candle in wind. The uncertainty is not a failure, it is a legacy in itself. Cahokia scattered its people so widely, so long ago, that no single nation can wrap its arms around the whole inheritance. And so the cousins wait, all along the water. Each one carries a shard, each one keeps a song. Together, without ever gathering in one place again, they are the living answer to the empty mound sleeping under Illinois grass. Long after the last fires cooled on Monk's Mound, the story kept walking. It walked west with the people who left the Bottomlands. It walked into tall grass and river bluffs, into winter lodges built of earth and elm bark, into the mouths of grandmothers who taught it to grandchildren, who taught it to their own. Picture one such traveler. She has no name we can speak now, but the Osage remember women like her, and so do the Ponca. She was born beside a slow brown river, in a village that once looked toward a great city on the horizon. When she was a girl, that city was already emptying. The Plaza no longer filled with feasting crowds. The high mound stood dark against the sky. Her mother pointed to it once and said, "That place is finished, but the sky above it is not." The girl grew up watching her people pack their lives into bundles. She learned the weight of a clay pot on her hip, the smell of dried corn in a leather sack, the ache of walking day after day into land she had never seen. Her family moved west along the Missouri, following the bend of the river like a thread pulled from a torn cloth. They stopped where the grass ran to the edge of the world. They built round earth lodges with sod roofs that bloomed with wildflowers in spring. She carried the old city inside her like a seed. When her own children were small, she told them of a place where the mounds stood tall as hills, where paths ran straight and long, where people gathered under a wooden circle to watch the sun step across the horizon. She told them of a birdman painted in shell beads. She told them of a chief who once climbed to the top of the world and looked down on 10,000 fires. The children listened. Some believed. Some thought she was mixing the old times with dreams, but they kept the stories anyway, because that is what you do with the words of an elder. And so the tale of the Mound City moved west with them, softened by prairie wind, colored by new rivers and new hills. Among the Osage, there are old songs about a time when the people lived along a great river and built high places to touch the sky. Among the Ponca, there are memories of migrations, of splitting from a larger nation, of coming from somewhere east and downstream. The Omaha and the Cow and the Quapaw carry pieces too. Siouan tongues share old roots, and old roots often reach back into the same dark soil. Some elders today will say plainly, "Our people once lived in that city." Others say the connection is only missed, only guess, only the wishful reaching of scholars who want a clean answer. Both voices deserve a seat by the fire. The truth is that oral tradition is a river, not a map. It bends. It carries silt from 100 places. It reaches the sea changed from its source, but still the same water. Linguists have listened. They have noted the spread of Siouan speakers across a huge stretch of the middle of the continent. They have wondered if that spread began with a great dispersal from the Mississippi Bottomlands. Other researchers push back gently. They say the movement of language is not always the movement of a single city's people. They say we should be careful not to press a whole region into one origin story. Still, when a Ponca grandmother speaks of the old country, she does not mean Europe. She means somewhere east, somewhere with rivers wide as inland seas, somewhere with earthen hills built by hands. Whether that memory reaches Cahokia itself, or one of its cousins, no one can say for sure. The memory does not need certainty to be true. Our traveler, the woman with no name we can speak, died on the plains under an open sky. Her grandchildren buried her the old way and moved on. Her story kept walking. It walked into the mouths of children who would never see a mound, who would grow up with buffalo instead of maize, who would know winter as a white ocean. And still, sometimes, one of them would look east at sunset and feel a tug they could not explain. That tug is what remains, not proof, not documents, just a thread stretched thin across 1,000 miles, humming faintly when the wind is right. The people who left Cahokia did not vanish. They walked into other names, other tongues, other homes, air, and they carried a city with them, folded small, tucked deep, sleeping in the corners of stories still told today. After all the stories, after all the guesses, we come back to what the ground itself has to say. Because the ground does speak in its quiet way. It speaks through broken pots and stone tools. It speaks through the shape of a jaw, the wear on a tooth, the tiny signature of minerals locked inside old bone. And when researchers listen, patiently, over decades, the ground gives up small confessions. The pottery is one of the loudest voices in the late years of Cahokia. The styles begin to shift. The old, smooth, shell-tempered jars, with their round shoulders and careful curves, share the shelves with something newer. Pots with pinched rims, pots with cord marks pressed into the wet clay, pots that look more like the work being made far to the north and west. It is as if two hands took turns at the same fire. Some scholars see this as proof that new people were arriving. Others see it as Cahokians themselves, changing their tastes, borrowing ideas from cousins upriver. The clay does not tell us which. Then there are the bones, deep in the earth, under the mounds and beneath the old plaza floors. The bones of the people wait. For a long time, they only offered up the shape of a life, a broken arm healed crooked, a tooth ground down by grit in the corn, a child who did not live past a hard winter. But newer tools can read bone like a book written in minerals. The strontium in a tooth remembers the water a person drank as a child. The oxygen in an old rib remembers the rain that fell on the fields where the wheat and squash and corn grew. When researchers tested the bones at Cahokia, they found something strange and beautiful. Many of the people buried in the great city were not born there. Some had come from the north, some from the south, some from places researchers still cannot pin down on a map. Cahokia was a gathering place. People walked to it from every direction, lived their lives inside its wooden walls, and were laid to rest in its soil. If people came from everywhere, then when the city emptied, they may have gone back to everywhere, a slow scattering, like seeds carried on 100 different winds. That is what makes the answer so hard to hold. There is no single road out of Cahokia. There is no one river that carries all the descendants. The people who built this city were already a mixed and traveling folk. Their children and grandchildren may sleep tonight in Oklahoma, in Missouri, in Wisconsin, in Arkansas, in South Dakota, in Ontario. Their stories may live inside a dozen tribal nations, each one holding a piece of the old memory, none of them holding the whole. And there is the harder truth beneath the science. Many indigenous nations today have complicated feelings about being tied to Cahokia. Some welcome the connection, some do not. To claim Cahokia is to claim a place shaped by kings and pyramids and a way of life that later peoples chose to leave behind. The leaving itself may have been the lesson. The scattering may have been the point. To go back and say, "These are my ancestors," is not only a scientific question. It is a question about what kind of ancestors a people wish to keep. So the bones confess a little, the pottery confesses a little, the stories confess a little, and still the great question stands, patient as the mound itself. Where did they go? All those tens of thousands, the farmers and the priests, the children and the grandmothers, the men who carved copper into hawks, and the women who painted pots by firelight. Where did their footsteps fall when they left the plaza for the last time? Maybe the answer is that they did not go anywhere at all. In the way we mean, maybe they simply became the Osage on their hills, became the Ponca on their rivers, became the Quapaw and the Pawnee and the Wichita and the Kanza, became the Mississippian towns that flowered downriver and lasted for centuries after the great city fell quiet, became 100 smaller lives, each one carrying a spark of the old fire, none of them needing to remember the whole. That is the door the mystery leaves open, not a locked room, not a dead end, a door that opens onto a wide land full of living people, and a night sky full of stars, and a river that has never stopped running. Somewhere out there, the answer walks around in ordinary bodies, eating ordinary suppers, remembering ordinary things, and the ground keeps its patient counsel. So the fire has burned down to soft red coals now. The wind has quieted outside. The story has walked its long path from the bottomlands of the Mississippi, up the sides of Monk's Mound, through the plazas and the longhouses, and out along the roads that led away in every direction. And here we are at the end of it, sitting together in the hush. Cahokia is still there tonight. You could drive to it in the morning if you wanted. The mounds rise from a wide green field just across the river from St. Louis, quiet as sleeping animals, their grassy shoulders rounded by 1,000 years of rain. Highways hum somewhere to the north. A radio tower blinks on the far side of the plain. But the mounds themselves keep their own time, slow and patient, as if they are still counting the sunrises. Walk out onto the great plaza in the early morning, and the grass is silver with dew. Meadowlarks call from the tall stems. A rabbit crosses the path and pauses, ears up, then bounds away. The air smells of wet earth and clover. You can climb the long wooden stairs that switch back up the side of Monk's Mound, and at the top the wind moves through your hair, the way it moved through the hair of the man who stood there when the city was full. From up there you can see the shape of what once was, the wide flat plain, the smaller mounds scattered like green loaves across the fields, the line of the creek where the causeways once bridged the water. If you squint,